The largest reciprocal tariffs ever imposed by President Donald Trump have sent shockwaves across global economies, as the US tries to reshape the world's trade dynamics. But what if the United States itself faces a recession? Which countries would be the first to feel the domino effect? It may sound like a worst-case scenario, but the truth is numerous nations rely heavily on the US for survival. From trade to investment, their economies are deeply intertwined with America's. When the US falls, they won't be far behind, sparking a risk of catastrophic economic collapse. In this video, we'll uncover the 10 countries that would face total collapse in the wake of a US recession. And make sure to watch until the end. The final country will shock you and completely change the way you view the power dynamics of the global economy. Mexico. You might think that if the US falls into a recession, Mexico would remain unaffected. But the reality is far more alarming. These two economies are tightly intertwined. Every year, billions of dollars move between the US and Mexico. If the US economy weakens, it could cause significant damage to Mexico's financial stability. By 2023, around 80% of Mexico's exports went to the US, including cars, electronics, and agricultural products. A sharp decline in American consumer demand could lead to a rapid economic downturn in Mexico. Unemployment would soar, and poverty would spread quickly across the nation. Moreover, Mexico's growing dependency on remittances from the US has become a lifeline for millions of families. If US wages fall, these vital remittances could dwindle, pushing entire communities to the brink. The result? Mexico facing a crisis of near catastrophic proportions. Canada. If you believe Canada could thrive without depending on the US economy, think again. It may surprise you to know that nearly 75% of Canada's exports are sent to the US. A recession in the US would have severe consequences for Canada. While many may assume Canada can rely on its vast natural resources, oil prices are closely linked to American demand. When the US economy slows, oil prices fall, and Canada's oil sector suffers drastically. This could result in massive job losses and a housing market crash. Even with Canada's strong social systems, the strain on its economy could trigger a financial crisis, leaving millions struggling to stay afloat. Can Canada survive without its economic ties to the US? Unlikely. Before we continue, make sure to smash that subscribe button. It's the best way to stay updated with more shocking, must-know content like this. Stay tuned, because next we're heading to South Korea, a country that could face a tech-driven collapse if the US economy takes a hit. South Korea. Have you ever wondered how a global powerhouse like South Korea could face the effects of a US recession? It's not as unlikely as it seems. With major companies like Samsung and Hyundai, South Korea's economy is deeply entwined with the US market. In fact, in 2023, over 14% of the country's GDP came from exports to the United States, particularly in high-demand sectors like electronics and automotive. So, what happens if the US hits a recession? A sudden downturn would drastically reduce demand for South Korean products. As South Korea's largest export, semiconductors would bear the brunt of the blow. American tech companies, major consumers of these chips, would sharply cut back their spending, sending shockwaves throughout the industry. The consequences would go far beyond the tech sector. A recession in the US could lead to widespread economic strain in South Korea, resulting in job losses, inflation, and decreased consumer confidence. The resulting instability could trigger a chain reaction, crippling the economy and making life increasingly difficult for South Korean workers. This economic domino effect could also affect neighboring East Asian countries that rely on South Korean exports. The big question remains, can South Korea survive this storm? The pressure is mounting and time is running out. Brazil. What if Brazil, the powerhouse of South America's economy, could be knocked down by something as simple as a US recession? The idea might seem far-fetched at first, but Brazil's ties to the US are far stronger than many might think. From soybeans to iron ore and oil, the US is one of Brazil's largest trading partners, with over 20% of Brazil's exports heading straight to American shores in 2023. That's a significant chunk of their economy, and any downturn in US demand could send shockwaves through Brazil. Take the agricultural sector, for example. With crops like soybeans deeply integrated into American trade, a drop in demand could devastate profits. This, combined with rising unemployment, could push millions deeper into poverty, exacerbating an already widening wealth gap. The social and economic strain would be enormous. But the danger doesn't stop there. Brazil's government debt is rapidly increasing, making it vulnerable to external shocks. If the US enters a recession, global commodity prices would likely drop, particularly oil, Brazil's key export. This could cause the Brazilian real to sink, sparking inflation and widespread social unrest. So, here's the question. Can Brazil weather this storm, or will it collapse under the pressure? The answer is still uncertain. Before we move on, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. You might just find that a lot of people are tuning in from the same city. Let's give each other a shout out. Next up, we'll dive into India, a country that relies heavily on US outsourcing contracts. Stay tuned because this could get wild. India. What if a US recession caused India's booming outsourcing industry to collapse? It might seem far-fetched, but the truth is that India's economy is deeply intertwined with the US for stability. A staggering 60% of India's IT sector revenue is directly tied to American demand, making it highly vulnerable. Picture this: a sudden economic slowdown in the US could lead American companies to slash their IT budgets and pull back on outsourcing. This would send shockwaves throughout India's job market, especially in cities like Bengaluru and Hyderabad, where millions rely on the tech industry. Without US funding, Indian companies would be forced to cut salaries, lay off employees, and halt ongoing projects. The fallout: an economic crisis for countless Indians who depend on these jobs to survive. But the damage doesn't end there. India also relies heavily on remittances from its workers abroad, many of whom are in the US. If the American economy were to collapse, the flow of money back home would dry up, leaving families struggling to make ends meet. Can India weather this storm? It's uncertain, but with such a fragile economic structure, the road ahead is bleak. Turkey. Have you ever considered the possibility that a US recession could lead to the collapse of Turkey's economy? It may sound surprising, but Turkey is deeply intertwined with the US economy. At the moment, Turkey is already battling soaring inflation and a rapidly depreciating currency. If the US falls into a recession, Turkey stands as one of the most vulnerable nations to economic downfall. But how could this happen? Turkey's exports are highly dependent on the US market, ranging from textiles to machinery. When the US economy weakens, the demand for Turkish goods drops sharply. This would send export-driven industries into a downward spiral, damaging the country's economic stability. But it doesn't end there. Turkey also relies heavily on foreign investments to support its economy. If a global recession hits, American investors are likely to withdraw their funds, triggering a rapid decline in the value of the Turkish lira and driving inflation even higher. You might think that Turkey's strategic location between Europe and Asia would give it an economic advantage, but the reality is that its reliance on US trade, capital, and tourism makes it vulnerable. As inflation surges, unemployment rises, and public unrest grows, Turkey could face a dire economic crisis and potential political instability. So, can Turkey survive without the US? The situation is far more complex than it might seem. Before we move on, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. It's the best way to keep up with more jaw-dropping content like this. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Next up, we'll dive into Argentina, a country that has been struggling with economic issues for years. Would a US recession push it over the edge? Stay tuned to find out. Argentina. Have you ever wondered how a nation already struggling economically can be pushed further into disaster when global conditions turn sour? Argentina is the perfect case study of what can happen when a major economy like the US enters a recession. You might be shocked at just how much Argentina relies on external factors to stay afloat. For years, Argentina's economy has been in disarray, with inflation soaring above 100% and the peso losing its value daily. Yet, despite this turmoil, Argentina remains highly dependent on exports like soybeans, oil, and wheat, many of which are sent to the US. If the US falls into a recession, the demand for these vital exports could collapse, potentially unraveling Argentina's already unstable economy. You would think a country like Argentina might be able to withstand this, but its overwhelming reliance on international trade and foreign debt makes it exceedingly vulnerable. What happens if Argentina can't repay its loans? With US banks tightening credit, securing loans could become an impossible task, potentially leading to a sovereign debt crisis. Imagine the government defaulting on its obligations. This could trigger hyperinflation and widespread social unrest. Argentina's situation is like a ticking time bomb, and a US recession could be the trigger. But here's the twist: Argentina's collapse wouldn't just affect them. The ripple effects could drag other nations into the chaos. What's next? Stay tuned to uncover the unfolding story. Saudi Arabia. Imagine this: Saudi Arabia, the powerhouse of the Middle East, facing a collapse under the weight of a US recession. Sounds far-fetched? It's not. Saudi Arabia's economy is heavily tied to the US, with over 90% of its revenue coming from oil exports, and the US is one of its biggest buyers. But what happens when the US hits a recession and oil demand drops significantly? If the US cuts back on oil imports because of a sluggish economy, Saudi Arabia stands to lose a massive chunk of its income. But it doesn't stop there. Falling oil prices could cause the entire financial system to implode. You might think the kingdom could weather the storm with its vast reserves, but the truth is, oil isn't just a commodity, it's the lifeblood of their economy. Without constant revenue from oil, Saudi Arabia could find itself in a deep financial crisis. Imagine a country that has spent billions to diversify its economy, only to see everything crumble. What happens when unemployment rises and social unrest follows? Saudi Arabia could face a crisis of historic proportions, and the future of the kingdom might hang in the balance. Before we move forward, thank you so much for watching until this point. Drop a 1 in the comments as a sign of encouragement, and we'll keep bringing you even more amazing videos in the future. Next up, we'll explore Nigeria, a country with a rapidly growing population and a highly unstable economy. Could a US recession push Nigeria to the brink? Stay tuned to find out. Nigeria. Have you ever wondered how a resource-rich country like Nigeria could face collapse during a global recession? It might surprise you to learn just how fragile Nigeria's economy is, even with its vast natural resources. The reality is, Nigeria could be just one step away from economic disaster if the US enters a recession. The reason? Nigeria is heavily reliant on global trade, particularly oil exports. More than 90% of the country's export revenue comes from oil, with a large portion of it flowing to the US market. So when the US economy suffers and oil demand drops, Nigeria is hit hard. The immediate loss of oil revenue would make it extremely difficult for the Nigerian government to fund essential services, potentially throwing the country into a full-blown crisis. But there's more to the story. While Nigeria's oil wealth might seem like a protective cushion, it actually contributes to the nation's economic vulnerability. Beyond the oil market, Nigeria is struggling with widespread poverty, high unemployment, and political instability. A US recession would exacerbate these issues, especially since many Nigerians rely on remittances sent from abroad. If the US economy weakens, these remittances could slow down or stop altogether, forcing families into even deeper poverty. Imagine fewer jobs, higher inflation, and growing unrest sweeping through the nation. To sum it up, a US recession could unleash an economic nightmare in Nigeria. With its dependence on oil, weak infrastructure, and political instability, the country would face an uphill to recover. Could this be the breaking point for Africa's most populous nation? You might be surprised at the answer. China. Imagine this: China, the world's second largest economy, has been riding a wave of prosperity for decades. But what if a US recession were to strike? Could this economic giant weather the storm? The reality might be more unsettling than we think. China's economy is intricately tied to the United States, particularly through manufacturing and exports. The US alone imports nearly $450 billion worth of Chinese goods annually, serving as a crucial lifeline for the country's economic stability. But what would happen if this lifeline were to be cut off? A US recession would likely cause a sharp decline in demand for Chinese products. The factories China's economic engine would slow dramatically, possibly grinding to a halt. This disruption would trigger widespread job losses, with many factories forced to shut down. Could China's economy bounce back from such a severe shock? The issue goes beyond trade. China is also highly reliant on US investments. American companies have poured billions into the country over the years, helping fuel growth. But if those investments begin to shrink due to economic uncertainty, the strain on China's financial system could become devastating. To make matters worse, China's already significant corporate debt is a ticking time bomb. As businesses and the government have borrowed extensively, how much longer can China maintain economic stability under such pressure? The situation is further exacerbated by the possibility of a global recession. If other countries around the world start tightening their belts, demand for Chinese-made products could fall even more. With fewer customers, China's economic woes would deepen, leaving the country vulnerable to long-term stagnation. If China's economy begins to falter, the global economic landscape could shift in ways we never expected. Rising debt, plummeting demand, and a lack of economic certainty could leave China struggling to find its footing. The question remains, is China's position as the second largest economy in the world truly as secure as we once thought? The future is anything but predictable. As we've explored, a US recession would create ripples across the global economy, impacting major players like Saudi Arabia, Nigeria, and China. The far-reaching effects would challenge the stability of the global financial system. But with the looming threat of reciprocal tariffs, especially with China's retaliation, the pressure on these economies is mounting. We'll be closely monitoring how these situations unfold. If you found this video insightful and want to stay informed about future developments, make sure to hit that subscribe button, give us a thumbs up, and share with friends who might benefit from this content. Your support keeps us going and ensures we continue delivering valuable videos. Don't forget to click the notification bell so you're always in the loop. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.